My name is Michael Weiland with Sumption of Weiland in Sioux Falls. And first off, we're just glad that everybody has made time in their day to come to Aberdeen for these convenings. It's great the Bush Foundation has supported South Dakota Community Foundation in this way. And we have a very small group here this afternoon, and that's just fine. You know, I can easily imagine that nonprofit regulation probably isn't the most popular topic. You know, it certainly doesn't have the most excitement appeal, and that's fine. You know, those of us who work in the sector know there are things that we have to do as well as things we like to do, and regulation often falls into the have to do category. But I thank you all for being here. I like to run a very informal presentation style, and particularly with such a small group. If you guys have questions or concerns or questions or arguments, just, you know, raise your hand or just shout out, let me know. I really like it to be as interactive as possible. All the slides I'm showing you, like all the slides from all the presenters today, are available on the South Dakota Community Foundation website. So don't feel like you have to write down absolutely everything you see. But we're going to talk about staying in step with the government, emerging trends in government regulation and filing. Topics we're going to cover are kind of a how did we get here? Why is it that nonprofit regulation is becoming such a topic? Because those of us who have been in the sector for a long time know that 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, almost nobody talked about nonprofit regulation as a discrete topic. U.S. congressional oversight and scrutiny, what is Congress looking at these days? What are the trends on Capitol Hill? And then we're going to talk about some federal issues and state issues, mostly federal because the state really doesn't have a lot of issues with nonprofits. Federal issues, primarily the Form 990 and intermediate sanctions. And we'll talk about what intermediate sanctions are and what some of the implications of that are as we go along. How do we get here? Well, the nonprofit sector is very large and influential in the economy. Nonprofits raised about $300 billion last year. Nonprofit organizations employ about 8.5% of all U.S. workers. Excuse me, they employ 11% of all U.S. workers. Nonprofit sector accounts for about 8.5% of the U.S. gross domestic product. So it's a very, very large part of the American economy. There are about 1.5 million charities in the United States. That includes churches, and over 2 million nonprofit organizations as a whole. In addition to charities, there are other types of nonprofits such as service clubs, such as chambers of commerce, other business leagues, labor unions are nonprofits, country clubs are nonprofit organizations. There are some life insurance companies that are nonprofit organizations. But by far and away, charities, 501c3s, are the most prevalent type of nonprofit in the U.S. So we're talking, you know, I said 1.5 to 2 million nonprofits in the United States. So it's a vast part of the economy, vast part of our lives. But it's very splintered. There is no dominant player in charity like there's a dominant player in a lot of industries. We don't have a Coke versus Pepsi in the nonprofit world. The United Way, as an aggregate, all of its affiliates and the national organization combined, raise more money than any other charity in the United States. But even so, combined, they only raise about 1.5% of all the money that's raised in the U.S. in a given year. They raise about $4.5 billion, which is a lot of money. But it's only 1.5% of the $300 billion that's raised nationally. And most nonprofits are very small organizations with annual budgets under $1 million, mostly under, you know, $500,000. They employ fewer than 10 people. So it's very, very much a splintered market. Much more difficult for regulators and for the public really to understand and get their arms around and have a confidence in understanding. There's a perception of eroding confidence. Again, those of us who've worked in the sector for a while are aware of William Arimony and the United Way of America issues that happened in the early 1990s. More recently, the public has had concerns about how money was raised and spent for 9/11 related charities. and also Hurricane Katrina. There were some issues of nonprofit coordination and even some issues of funds not being spent appropriately. The sad part is that the General Accountability Office, the U.S. government, did an analysis after 9/11 and estimated that 97% of all the money raised for September 11 related charities was raised and spent appropriately. 97% did the right things, followed the rules, and used the money the way it was supposed to be used. 3%, either they couldn't figure it out, or else there was a belief that 3% of that money was just not raised or spent appropriately. Well, the problem is that 3% of $3 billion is still a lot of money. And so it attracts attention in the media. And somebody says, well, somebody embezzled $5 million. Somebody embezzled $10 million. You know, this much money was wasted on something that we had to throw away. Well, those get headlines. But all the good that's done doesn't get the same headlines. So there's a perception of eroding confidence. There's a trend towards more public scrutiny as a result, not only by the public at large, but more particularly by the media and also by elected officials. Also, the IRS is changing its role reluctantly. It doesn't want to do this. It's being pressured by Congress to change its role from pure financial regulation into broader governance oversight. And we see that with the new Form 990. They're asking all kinds of questions that have nothing to do with money. And that wasn't the IRS's idea. That was Congress's idea. And finally, the Form 990 and other information about charities is more readily accessible, particularly on the internet. So it's more possible than ever before for the general public, for the media, for self-appointed public watchdogs and other groups to get access to information about our sector and about our organizations. Information that they may or may not be able to interpret appropriately and may or may not be able to use effectively. Regulatory trends and influences, IRS intermediate sanctions. Intermediate sanctions basically have to do with conflicts of interest within nonprofit organizations and also have to do with excessive compensation. In other words, paying people associated with charities too much money. Or the other technical term is private inurement, which basically means an organization or an individual doing business with a charity gets more out of the deal themselves than the charity gets from the transaction. And the IRS says that's a definite no-no. If you're doing business with a charity, the charity should be getting at least as much value as you are as an individual. So intermediate sanctions regulations, technically Section 4958 of the Internal Revenue Code, was developed about 15 years ago to address some of those issues, and we'll talk about that more in due course. Sarbanes-Oxley was a corporate reform law passed about 7 years ago that really doesn't affect nonprofits except in two specific areas. Does anybody know what those two areas are, just out of curiosity? Okay. The two areas where Sarbanes-Oxley directly affects nonprofits is whistleblower protection and document destruction and retention policies. The rest of Sarbanes-Oxley applies to for-profit corporations but does not apply to nonprofit corporations. But there's a perception in the public that Sarbanes-Oxley is part of this tide of regulation and oversight and accountability of nonprofits. So, people who don't know any better talk about Sarbanes-Oxley as being part of the mix when it really isn't. Senate Finance Committee, mainly Senator Charles Grassley. Charles Grassley has had a strong interest in nonprofits and abuses by and of nonprofits for many years. He was responsible, for instance, in exposing excessive compensation and some poor management practices at the Smithsonian Institution several years ago. He has also been responsible for forcing some major changes in the way the American Red Cross governs itself. His role as chairman or as ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee gives him a lot of authority to write letters that people have to respond to, whether they're national charities or whether it's the IRS itself. There's a strong concern that charities are not taken advantage of either by individuals or anybody else, and There's a strong interest that the Finance Committee and Charles Grassley have in that nonprofits have to be accountable and that they have to be transparent. If the Republicans take over the Senate and Chuck Grassley is still a senator, expect that to increase, because that's a strong interest he has that is not shared to nearly the same extent by the current Finance Committee chair. So it's a matter of who holds the title of Mr. Chairman that makes a big difference. On the House side, they have less interest in nonprofits generally, but they have a strong interest in the nonprofit status of hospitals. There's a lot of concern that hospitals control a lot of money, that hospitals receive a lot of fees for service, and that many hospitals, if not most, have net revenue. In other words, they're profitable. At the same time, there's no specific requirement for a hospital to demonstrate that it is being charitable. It is expected to be charitable, but there's no specific criteria for what charitable means. And so the House Joint Tax Committee has taken a look at the nonprofit status of these large institutions, saying, why are they nonprofit? What makes them different from a for-profit hospital? And how do we know that they are being good community stewards? So that's where regulation on the House side seems to be going. Independent Sector, a national organization, did a panel on the nonprofit sector. It was a working group that developed input for charities regulation at the request of the Senate Finance Committee. Their attitude is that to the maximum extent possible, nonprofits can regulate themselves, but they did establish some 35 good governance practices that nonprofits should have. And so they are a player on the national scene trying to influence where charity regulation is going. One of the key points Independent Sector was saying is that the most important thing in regulating charities is enforcing laws and regulations that are already on the books. There is not so much a need for new law and regulation as there is for current law and regulation to be enforced. The IRS does not have sufficient resources to do that effectively. Also, it is not clear that the IRS has regulatory oversight responsibility over charities. So, it's a matter of enforcing existing laws and regulations more than putting in new laws and regulations. The IRS developed a set of governance best practices that it recommended for charities on the theory that well-governed charities are less likely to engage in illegal, immoral, or fattening financial practices. Now, I think you can have a very well-informed debate over whether that proposition is true. But that's what the IRS believes. And those good governance best practices formed the basis for many of the governance-related questions that are now in the Form 990. And the enforcement risk is not that the IRS is going to knock on your door and say, we think your nonprofit is not doing things right. We think there might be wrongdoing at your organization. That the IRS showing up at your door is not the real problem. The real problem is these folks, disgruntled employees, former employees, donors, disgruntled donors, people you serve who somehow decide that your organization has done something wrong. They might be correct, they might be incorrect, it doesn't really matter. The media know that a nonprofit controversy story sells news. And also there are self-appointed public advocates out there who can also raise questions about the governance and operation of a charity. I asked the question this morning, I'll ask it again this afternoon, have there been any instances of nonprofits in northeastern South Dakota that have been in the media for something other than the good work they do? I hadn't heard of any this morning. Those of you who follow the Sioux Falls media might be aware of a couple of instances in the fairly recent past, one of them being the Multicultural Center of Sioux Falls. Okay, well, there are a lot of things I can't say about that because they're a current client of mine. However, I can pretty much say what has already been in the media. There have been a lot of stories about the operations of the Multicultural Center, a little bit about its finances, and quite a bit about its now former executive director. And one thing that has been acknowledged in the media already is the fact that the Multicultural Center is a small nonprofit. It only has about a $600,000 budget. But it gets a lot of its money from governmental sources, and there's been some concern and a little bit surprise that the nonprofit had not focused extensively on policy and procedure. Because you had 2 or 3 full-time employees and about 4 part-time employees who were focused very strongly on delivering programs and services and not focused nearly as much on administration and management. So when things started hitting the papers and they say, well, where's your policy on this and what's your procedure on that? And da-da-da. Well, all of a sudden, the questions start getting vague, or the answers start getting vague, and you start saying, well, we're doing good things for people. Look at all the things we're doing. Well, once questions are asked about whether or not you're doing the right things, that's not a good enough answer. The other recent story, this is a follow-up to a story that came up last year, was the Sioux Empire Fair, where the business manager of the Sioux Empire Fair was convicted of embezzling about $600,000 from the organization. The former executive director, the business manager's boss, was not implicated in any of the embezzlement. However, he has now been sued by Minnehaha County because some of the money that was embezzled by the business manager was used to give gifts to the executive director. And the county wants to recover that money. And they maintain that he should have known better than to accept gifts from an employee, and he should have questioned where the money was coming from. The gifts included a motorcycle and a couple of vacations.
My executive director just looked at me like, hey, come on.
Well, we also had let me say this very clearly, a former client for whom we wrote grant applications. We had no other involvement in their operations than to do that. They were subsequently found, their executive director and business manager were subsequently found to have embezzled about a quarter of the agency's budget over a 4-year period. The total agency headcount at this organization was only 2.5 FTE. So if you have the executive director and the business manager colluding, then all you have left is a part-time person, probably a receptionist or something, who isn't in on it. And the board was disengaged enough and willing to believe the executive director and the business manager to the point where it wasn't discovered for a long time. Now, the problem was when it was discovered, most of the money, if not all the money that was embezzled, was federal grant money. Okay. Who investigates the embezzling of federal grant money? The FBI. So imagine the FBI walking into your agency with 2.5 FTE and a total budget of about $300,000 a year. It's an extreme case, but it happens, and it hit the papers. But these kind of scandals, these kinds of issues show up in the media more frequently than they used to.
When is the media going to have some scrutiny? So that they can be more ethical.
That's a really good question, and I'd love to teach that one too. I'd love to be a participant in that workshop. But I have sympathy for the media in that they are always asked to be instant experts on whatever they're covering. There are very few news organizations that have reporters and editors who are knowledgeable about any industry in particular, and the nonprofit industry specifically. So they're doing, most of them are doing the best they can as they're going along, but also their goal is different from ours. Our goal is to promote our industry and to promote our organization. Their goal is to get news that will sell papers and get people and get viewers to watch. And so things that we know that are wrong or inappropriate but not exceptional are things that they could very easily turn into a real story. And so we have to deal with that as best we can, and that's a crisis communications issue. But part of our defense is having good policy and procedure, being aware of the regulations, and having some preparation in place so we have good answers instead of being defensive and instead of attacking the attacker. And particularly, the fact that the 990 is available online. I assume everybody at some point has gone to guidestar.org. You can look up any nonprofit's Form 990 on guidestar.org and download a copy of it for free. It's a great way to do research. In fact, we're in the process of doing assisting in the hiring process for an organization in Sioux Falls. I'm fully expecting that the more qualified applicants, as part of their due diligence, will be looking at the organization's 990 by downloading it from GuideStar. That's one of the ways I'll know that that person is knowledgeable about nonprofits and is curious enough to know what they're getting themselves into.
But yet there's no way that you can actually know if somebody has downloaded your...
Right. Yep.
It's just available out there to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
You can't tell if somebody's...
No, you can't tell. But what I'm expecting in my case is the more qualified applicants will say, hey, I downloaded the 990 and I've got a few questions. Those are the ones that say, okay, these folks are motivated and they know something about the nonprofit sector. The new 990, let's talk about the new 990 for a few minutes. It began with the tax year, the 2008 tax year. Generally speaking, all 501c organizations must file. Exceptions are very limited and specific. Churches, however, are generally exempt from filing the Form 990. Remember, churches are included in the definition of 501c3s, public charities. But based on their religious nature, they are generally exempt from having to file a 990. Some do, particularly churches that operate social service or human service programs that are dependent on external funding sources. Whether it's foundation grants or occasionally governmental support, or just ones that decide that they want to file the 990 so that they can be more transparent to their donors. The filing thresholds, no, I don't expect you to read this, but it's in the slides, so when you download the slides, you can take a look at it. I couldn't believe the IRS had done this, but they actually changed the filing thresholds from year to year for a 4-year period. So which form you have to file depends on which year it is, as well as what your revenue and assets are as an organization. But beginning with the 2010 tax year, which will be filed in 2011, generally speaking, if your gross receipts are less than $50,000 a year, you can file the postcard electronically, the Form 990N, and be done with it. If your gross receipts are greater than $50,000, less than $200,000, and your total assets are less than $500,000, you can generally file the 990EZ. If your gross receipts are greater than $200,000 and or your total assets are greater than $500,000, then you got to file the long form. So, but every nonprofit has to file some form. And that's a big change because until 2008, most nonprofits didn't have to file at all. Because most nonprofits had gross receipts under $25,000 a year and didn't have to file anything. That's why last month, the IRS and the Urban Institute's National Center on Charitable Statistics were promoting the fact that 400,000 nonprofits were going to lose their tax-exempt recognition because they had failed to file a 990 for the previous 3 years. That's part of the new law. If you're a nonprofit and you don't file a 990 for 3 years, you lose your nonprofit recognition. Now you can have it restored without having to go through the whole reapplication process, but the thing is you lose your tax-exempt recognition if you don't file for 3 years. The good news is the IRS has said so many people didn't know about this, so many organizations didn't get their paperwork in time. We are not going to take any immediate action to pull anybody off the rolls yet. Just get your forms in as soon as possible. So if you're a small nonprofit or you know of other people who are involved in very small nonprofits, make sure they know that they have to at least file that electronic postcard return now, if they haven't already done it.
Now that's just
Right.
C6 or a C4, then it's different.
I believe so. I have not looked at the postcard requirements for C6s or C4s. Most of my clients are C3s, so I'm more familiar with the C3 issues than I am with the others. But one trend that I should point out is that what is happening now with charitable regulation, with C3 regulation, is more and more being applied to other nonprofits. So if you are a representative of a C6, a Chamber of Commerce, Business League is the IRS definition, assume that you're covered by the same rules as the 501c3s unless you can determine that you're not. It used to be the other way around. But when the new 990 came out, most of the reporting being required of charities is now being required of all nonprofits. So make sure you're not required to do it, because I would go into it with the assumption that all nonprofits have to do the same thing unless I can demonstrate that my nonprofit doesn't have to. Governance policies to have in place. Remember the IRS doesn't have enforcement authority on any of this, but the word to the wise has been that you should have these policies in place. You should be able to answer yes to the questions on the 990, because if you don't answer yes, that might or might not constitute an audit flag. Having a written conflict of interest policy. Fortunately, the IRS has a sample conflict of interest policy. It's now part of the application for tax-exempt recognition. So you can go up on the IRS website and look at those instructions and actually look at a sample conflict of interest policy. So if you wonder whether or not your organization's conflict of interest policy is up to speed, this is a great way to check it out. Is there a written whistleblower policy? Is there whistleblower protection for employees or others involved in your organization who point out misfeasance, malfeasance, nonfeasance? Written document retention or document destruction policies should have them in place. Do you have a joint venture policy? If you're a nonprofit that partners with for-profit entities or other organizations, you should have a policy that in part states that your nonprofit will get fair value from any joint venture in which it participates. Because there are for-profit, nonprofit ventures out there where the nonprofit is used for expenses and the for-profit is used to gather all the revenue. And in a lot of circumstances, that's actually legal. Not exactly best practice, but it's legal. And so the goal is, when you have joint ventures now, to make sure that the nonprofit doesn't suffer in the joint venture. You should always have contemporaneous minutes of boards and committees. You should be able to answer that your board of directors has reviewed the 990 before it was filed. You should have policies governing the public disclosure of the Form 990. You should have a compensation committee that reviews and sets executive compensation of board members if board members are involved in transactions with the organization. And also, in addition to the executive director, that compensation committee should also be setting compensation for the top financial officer in your organization. If you have a business manager or a CFO or a controller, anyone that has, a finance manager, finance director, anyone who has managerial level responsibility. I'm not talking about a bookkeeper. Anyone who has managerial level responsibility for the finances of the organization, that person is considered by the IRS to be essentially in the same category as the CEO. And you should also have an audit committee, is the recommendation. Now, in a lot of small organizations, it's real hard to have an audit committee when you have a small board and a small membership or a small community. But the theory is, particularly for mid-sized and larger organizations with mid-sized and larger budgets, you really need to have an audit committee. There are other reporting requirements that have nothing to do with governance per se, including lobbying disclosure, fundraising disclosure, and issues related to tax-exempt bonds. There are some nonprofits that can actually issue tax-exempt bonds. And so there's a lot of reporting and disclosure that's included as part of the new Form 990 in those areas. Public disclosure, most nonprofits are not aware of this, even now. But it has always been true. At your principal regional and district place of business, you must make available for inspection upon request your Form 1023, which is your application for tax-exempt recognition, which includes the Articles of Incorporation, the financial information for preceding 3 years, and the bylaws. Your last 3 Form 990s. Any correspondence from the IRS related to your tax-exempt recognition, all of that has to be available upon request. So if I walk into your office and talk to your receptionist or secretary, and I say, I would like to see your documents, the only acceptable answer is, yes, sir. Let me get them for you.
Anybody can ask for that?
Anybody. For any reason. For any reason. And they are allowed to sit down at your office, and they are allowed to page through them and look at every page. If they write or phone in and say, we want you to send us copies, they must be mailed within 30 days. Now, there are some conditions and exceptions. The first condition is you are entitled to recover reasonable postage and printing costs. So if someone walks in and says, I want copies of all this stuff, or I want you to mail me copies of all this stuff, you can recover the mailing costs and the printing costs. And in fact, I think in the regulation it sets a price of 15 cents a page for photocopying. That's considered somewhere in the reasonable range. I mean, as a good faith, reasonable person kind of rule, recover what it actually costs you to do it. You don't set a retail price for it, but you can recover what it actually costs you to get the work out. You can't charge for the time of the person, but you can charge for the actual hard dollar cost. And you charge the postage at actual. Whatever it actually costs you to put the stamp on the envelope. There is an exception for harassment. If there is a situation where all of a sudden you're inundated with public disclosure requests, and it looks like it's an orchestrated event of some kind. The thinking behind this was that there would be an advocacy organization of some kind that had angered someone on the other side of the issue. Whether we're talking about, say, right to life versus reproductive rights organizations, whether we're talking about, social justice organizations, say like ACORN, whether we're talking about ethnic or racial justice organizations, basically organizations that have an advocacy mission, and by virtue of having an advocacy mission, might have opposition. If you, as an organization, can demonstrate that there is a pattern of requests that constitutes harassment, it's tying up my entire staff, it's tying up my phone lines. I got people in the office constantly, all of a sudden out of nowhere. There's an exception to the requirement for disclosure in that case. Now, how do you document that? You document it as best you can. You hold on to the written requests. You hold on to the phone logs with all the messages. Make a list of the requests that have been made. And that's your safe harbor. That's your defense in case someone says, well, you're not complying with the law. I say, well, we try to comply with the law, but we're getting harassed. And there's a harassment exception. So that's one exception. Another exception to public disclosure is privacy concerns. For example, there are 990s that will include a lot of donor information. Not all of that donor information is discoverable by the general public. And older documents, for example, if your organization applied for tax-exempt recognition prior to 1987, you don't have to have that form available for inspection. Because the assumption is that there are a lot of organizations out there where that form is old enough that they don't have it on file anymore or can't find it. Yeah, so if you applied for tax-exempt recognition and 42 years ago when 1968, then odds are that it's entirely reasonable that that original application form might have been lost sometime in the last 42 years. Yeah. Well, that gets to document retention and document destruction policies, doesn't it? Because not only in document retention and document destruction, not only do you have to have a policy to hold on to things, you also have to have a policy when to get rid of things, because you don't want to hold on to things too long. But anyway, that's an exception. If for older organizations, we have an exception on that Form 1023, the application form. Any questions about any of this? Is this making sense to everybody, or have I lost everybody completely here so far? Okay, because now we get into intermediate sanctions. This is one of those things that I almost wish I didn't have to talk about, because it is so complex and so involved that I could lose everybody here in 5 minutes. And that's not because you're dumb people. You're all intelligent people and you're professionals. It's just this is really nitty-gritty stuff. The problem is that this is the stuff that the public really cares about. Who's taking advantage of the charity? Who has a conflict of interest that's getting the charity into trouble? That's what intermediate sanctions is all about. There was a perception by the IRS and Congress that nonprofits were getting away with abuses of their tax-exempt status. And the traditional approach, the only thing the IRS used to be able to do if there was a problem, was to revoke their tax-exempt status. That was the only remedy the IRS had. If they found, insider dealing, if they found excessive compensation, if they found conflicts of interest rampant within an organization, all the IRS could do is say, you're not a charity anymore. Well, the problem was that that really punishes the organizations and its beneficiaries, the people it serves, for the bad acts of individuals who were supposed to be in charge and doing the right thing. And so the IRS said, these folks are not being held properly accountable, so we're going to change the regulations so we can punish the individuals who are responsible or who should have known better. The individuals covered under intermediate sanctions, the technical term for this is disqualified persons. And don't ask me why they're disqualified, but the people who are under scrutiny for conflicts of interest, for excessive compensation, for private adornment, for those kinds of issues, all voting board members and their families, all CEOs, executive directors and their families, all treasurers and CFOs and their families. This one is particular to hospitals, and particularly for-profit, nonprofit hospitals with like a for-profit medical practice attached to them, that kind of thing. And then generally speaking, your major donors are subject to intermediate sanctions. If you get more than $5,000 from someone, and that someone is giving at least 2% of your annual revenue, then they are a disqualified person under intermediate sanctions. All the family members, and the other thing I'm going to point out about this is it accounts for any transaction that happens within a 5-year window. So it's not just whether they're a current employee or a current family member, there's a 5-year look-back period. The organizations covered under intermediate sanctions include 501c3 and 501c4s. 501c4s are called social welfare organizations. That includes most civic organizations, civic clubs, Kiwanis, Rotary, Lions, those kind of organizations. Private foundations are not covered under the new intermediate sanctions because they have similar rules they have to follow already. But we're talking about public charities. Churches are covered under intermediate sanctions even if they haven't filed for exempt recognition. Churches are covered under this even if they don't have their 501c3 determination from the IRS. Excess benefit, any transaction between an exempt organization, a nonprofit, and a disqualified person where the value of the benefit to the individual exceeds that provided to the exempt organization. If someone else is getting more out of the deal than the nonprofit is, then it's wrong. Whoops. And we have multiple tiers of penalties for what happens. And the penalties are all excise taxes with the idea of punishing the individuals involved and hopefully also refunding the value of whatever the excess benefit was. So we're going to make the nonprofit whole, and we're going to assess a penalty against whoever did the wrong thing. That's the first tier. The second tier is we're going to hit that individual for twice the value of the benefit because they didn't go ahead and fess up in the beginning. And also managers, officers and directors and senior employees who knowingly approve an excess benefit transaction are also subject to a penalty. So if you're the CEO or you're the CFO or you're a board member and you know what's going on is wrong, but you approve it anyway, then you're on the hook along with all the other people who did the wrong thing. Excess benefit transactions for employees. Compensation is number one. Compensation is more than salary. It includes all the benefits that an employee receives. You always have the CEO. You always have the CFO, the top management official, the top financial official. Those are always included. Also, any other highly compensated employee, which in 2009 means anyone receiving $150,000 or more in total compensation, is also subject to intermediate sanctions, regardless of their title or position. It used to be they had to be a manager. It used to be they had to have budgetary authority, like over a department or something. Now it doesn't matter. Anyone making more than $150,000. And the other one is revenue sharing transactions. This is particularly the case in fundraising. If any of you have a development director or an advancement VP who receives part of their compensation, any part of their compensation, as a bonus or as an incentive for successful results. Now we all know that the fundraising societies, AFP and the others, say that percentage-based compensation for fundraising is unethical. However, there are things that are ethical where you can set incentive compensation based on achieving certain fundraising targets. Well, what the IRS says, whenever you do that, you got to make sure it meets market standards. You can't compensate someone with a huge bonus just because you love them and they did a great job. You've got to prove that it's standard practice. You've got to prove it's within their total compensation is within the bounds of reasonableness. So that's another thing to watch, particularly in mid-sized and larger organizations, that have full-time development directors or advancement VPs, or who do a lot of fundraising. Maybe even a CEO would be eligible for this, as part of their total compensation package. Safe harbor. That's right. Yeah, is that right? Yeah, safe harbor. How do you protect yourself? How does your organization protect itself? Where is the safe harbor here? And the other one is rebuttable presumption of reasonableness, a fancy phrase that means that, generally speaking, the IRS is going to assume that your charity is doing the right thing until or unless it looks like something wrong was going on. So we're going to presume you're doing the right thing until we have reason to believe otherwise. Well, what's your safe harbor? You document everything you can document. You get written bids for products, independent land appraisals, etc. You consult with legal counsel, accountants, etc. But you make sure, and I put this in here for a reason, that those legal counsel, those accountants are not your board members. Independent means independent. If they're on your board, they should not be providing services to your nonprofit. They can provide advice, they can provide information, but they should not be providing services if they're on your board, because that's a conflict of interest. Yes?
Question to that, just to clarify. Let's say that a nonprofit, you're on the board of a nonprofit, and then the nonprofit would like to hire you, though, to put on a training for its membership.
Right.
How do they work that? Is that, it's just one tier down. It's not, in essence, your staff of the nonprofit, but it's membership.
It is a conflict of interest because, there are a couple of things you have to do. One of them is that you have to make sure that you as a board member recuse yourself from the selection process and the approval process. The other thing you need to do is make sure that the organization has done its due diligence at looking at other trainers to make sure that other trainers have had an equal opportunity to secure that business. And the third thing you have to be sure of is that the organization is paying you no more than it would pay anybody else to do the same work with the same qualifications and the same facts and circumstances. If you were looking at doing it on an ongoing basis rather than a one-time basis, I would counsel you to get off the board. I mean, that would be, because the longer the conflict goes on, the more likely it is to be unacceptable to somebody. So, and partially it's sometimes a matter of just getting lazy. Well, we've done bids for the last 3 years and haven't really heard much of anything. We're just going to keep on using Jane because Jane's always here. Well, then all of a sudden they don't have their safe harbor anymore. And someone can raise the questions and the defense isn't nearly as eloquent as it would be otherwise. Boards and managers who rely on independent counsel are generally safe from penalties under intermediate sanctions. If you get the independent advice, and that independent advice is presumably competent, I mean, you're not going out and asking your Uncle Frank. You're going out and asking an attorney who represents himself or herself as knowing something about nonprofit law. Then you should be okay. Demonstrate reasonableness through documentation. Having the conflict of interest policy, having board minutes, board recruitment program, and document the manager's conflicts. You should have conflict of interest disclosures from all board members and all senior managers every year. And there are samples of conflict of interest disclosure documents, various places. Board Source has them. I know American Society of Association Executives has examples. There are other places where you can get them, both in print and available for download. But you should get disclosure annually. Yeah.
When you're looking at those and getting those annually,
Yeah.
in a state like South Dakota, a small state, it's very hard to have board members where you have no board members.
Yep.
Any time.
Right.
Disclose the fact that it's there, and if whenever that's brought up, that's disclosed, they leave the room, or they're not part of the decision.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right. Right.
Do they have to leave the room, or can they just not participate in discussion?
You're better off having them leave the room. Because if they're sitting in the room, they're still participating in the discussion. Remember that 70% of all communication is nonverbal. That's right. Watch against the folded arms, the eye roll, the laugh. All of that stuff, all those nonverbals can come in. Not to mention the stare. You're not going to cross me, are you? You're not going to mess with my business, are you? You're better off having those folks out of the room. Going back for a second, real quickly, I want to say about compensation. Many nonprofit organizations are commissioning compensation studies to document the appropriateness of compensation for their executive directors, for their CEOs, and for their CFOs. Please remember that setting compensation is a board function. It is not a staff function. Researching executive compensation is a board function. It is not an executive or staff function. You can't be an executive director and say, hey, board, I commissioned a compensation study, and here's what the guy I hired found. to substantiate my salary. It's the board that has to do that work in order for it to pass muster with the IRS. Okay. South Dakota state registration, real simple. Real simple. We are one of very few states that does not have much in the way of nonprofit regulation, particularly charitable solicitation registration and having to file detailed annual reports. In fact, the process for being a nonprofit in South Dakota is remarkably simple. You file your articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State. They say go ahead and apply for tax-exempt recognition from the IRS. 1023 is the form for charities, 501c3s. Form 1024 is the application form for all other nonprofits. Then you can apply for South Dakota sales tax exemption if you're eligible. But note that most South Dakota nonprofits are not eligible for exemption from sales tax. That's something I didn't know when I started in practice 20 years ago. And because most of my business was governmental, when I had a nonprofit client, I was not charging them sales tax, and I should have. Our practice now is when we bill a nonprofit for the first time, we bill the sales tax and then say, if you're claiming exemption, delete the sales tax from the bill and give us a copy of your exemption certificate from the state. Because most nonprofits are not exempt from sales tax in South Dakota. There's a narrow list of exceptions for that. And finally, you file an annual report with the South Dakota Secretary of State. It's like a $10 fee, basically just letting them know you're still in business and what you're doing. It's a one-page form. There really isn't much of anything to remaining in compliance with the state of South Dakota. If you are a nonprofit doing business in multiple states, make sure you're complying with the laws of those states. If you also work in Minnesota or North Dakota, they have laws that are different, and you have to be in compliance with the laws of every state. If anybody here, for example, has an online donation capability on their organization's website, that's something you have to be very careful about, because unless you are careful about it, you could end up having to file with the 41 states that require you to file on an annual basis. And the registering for charitable solicitation and doing those filings in those 41 states will cost you about $20,000 a year. So don't just go out and say, okay, we're gonna have a donate button on our website and it's going to be great. Well, it's great until someone catches you at it and says, hey, you owe us a bunch of money, and you got to file a bunch of paperwork. So, but as long as you're operating within South Dakota, there's remarkably little you have to do. Now, there are some counties that have their own ordinances about charitable organizations. For example, in Sioux Falls and Minnehaha County, if you want to do a charitable raffle of some kind, you have to register with the county before you can sell tickets. Now, a lot of charities don't know that. Now, there might be charities in Lincoln County think, well, we don't have to do that because we're in Lincoln County. Well, the problem is if they're selling tickets in Minnehaha County, they still need to register. And there are a lot of nonprofits that think as long as they're good with state law, that they're good overall. As long as they're in compliance with the state, then they're in compliance. Well, there's federal law and there's local law. And I'm not saying you can't do things, it's just you have to be aware of all the laws and regulations that apply. Any questions? Anything I haven't covered? Anything you want me to go into more depth about? Anything at all? Well, great. I really appreciate your attention, appreciate your coming, and I think it'll be a short break, and then we'll get to the last session of the day. Thank you.